Writing from Saumur in October 1892 to a colleague in London, the author Robert Louis Stevenson expressed very well a typical request that one hears to this day. This is a fairly long quote. Perhaps it might amuse you to send us any pattern of wallpaper that might strike you as cheap, pretty, and suitable for a room in a hot and extremely bright climate. The room I have in mind is a sort of bed and sitting room, pretty large, lit on three sides, and the colour in favour is a topazy yellow. But then with what colour to relieve it? For a little workroom of my own at the back, I should rather like to see some patterns of unglossy, well, I'll be hanged if I can describe this colour. It's not Turkish, and it's not Roman, and it's not Indian, but it seems to partake of the two last. And yet it can't be either of them, because it ought to be able to go with vermilion. Ah, what a tangled web we weave. Anyway, with what brains you have left, choose one and send me some, many, patterns of this exact shade. The naming of colours has always presented a problem. In 19th century Britain, several attempts were made to lay down standard names that might be agreed upon in order to remove confusion. One such, which was aimed at the natural scientist, was Patrick Syme's 1821 revision of a book called On the External Characters of Fossils or of Minerals. The original was first published in 1774 by the German mineralogist A.G. Werner. A copy of this work was carried by the naturalist Charles Darwin on his voyage of the Beagle. In January 1833, Darwin recorded his first sighting in a small field notebook. Many glaciers, beryl blue, most beautiful, contrasted with snow. This was presumably a term that he would have taken from this page of greens, where two, albeit bluish colours, are described as beryl under the heading mineral. Examples of other natural phenomena sharing similar colours could be found under the headings animal and vegetable. Some years later, the Scottish interior decorator and painter David Ramsay Hay produced a very complex work of colour theory, in which he displayed 240 coloured triangular samples. These consisted largely of the primary colours of red, yellow, and blue, the secondary colours of green, purple, and orange, and the tertiary colours of russet, citrine, and olive. He also illustrated the results of mixing each colour with varying amounts of black and white. Hay believed that the ability of seeing and appreciating beauty was something that we were born with, and that, like an appreciation of music, it could be cultivated. His nomenclature of colour approached the matter in a purely logical and progressive fashion. It must be assumed that there was a demand for this sort of work because Hay published a number of other books with colours shown in the same format. When one considers how complex some of the decorative treatments of the times were, it can be seen that an understanding of the basic laws of colour was highly desirable. In the early years of the 20th century, there were further attempts to add names to colours. By that time, for example, the assortment of chrysanthemum colours had become so extensive that in 1905, the French Society of Chrysanthemum Growers published a repertoire de couleurs, which then came to be used as a colour catalogue in many other fields. In 1912, an American ornithologist, Robert Ridgway, published Colour Standards and Colour Nomenclature, a work of over 1,000 colours, the aim of which was the standardisation of colours and colour names, so that naturalists or others who might need to speak or write about colours might do so without confusion. By definition, works such as ridgeways were printed in small quantities and were very expensive. Their reach was therefore limited. However, they did not disappear entirely and continued to influence later works on colour. At about the same time as the two previous works, an English paint manufacturer, Pinchin Johnson and Company, contacted 200 decorators and asked them to list the 60 colours that they used most. There was no reason why 60 should have been chosen, but that number was considered to cover most needs. Having selected the 60, the company then painted 4 versions of each colour onto cards, sent these cards to all the other paint manufacturers in the United Kingdom, and asked them to select which version of the 4, for example grass green, best represented that colour. The results of 30 of these 60 colours selected can be seen here. In 1901, the British Council of the Institution of Civil Engineers formed a committee to consider standardising iron and steel sections. As a result, the variety of sizes of structural steel sections was reduced from 175 to 113, and attention began to be paid to other components. 2 years later, the number of different gauges used by trams was reduced from 75 to 5. As well as encouraging economies to be made, attention was also given to the quality of the goods being produced. The British Standard Mark, or Kite Mark, was introduced and applied to products that met the required standards. During the First World War, British standards were used by the Admiralty, the War Office, the Board of Trade, Lloyd's Register, the Home Office, the Road Board, the London County Council, and many of the smaller Commonwealth countries. During the 1920s, standardisation spread to Canada, Australia, South Africa, and New Zealand. Interest was also developing in the United States and in Germany. It was inevitable that the newly named British Standards Institution would consider paint colour, and in 1931 they published a range of 64 colours, which was called BS 381C. The range was revised a number of times, with new colours added and some removed. Here, for example, is the reduced wartime range, which shows, amongst other things, colours used by the government, the military, and for transport. In 1937, the British Colour Council published a book of traditional British colours, one of whose aims was to provide colour references for the flags and bunting that was going to be hung to celebrate the coronation of King George VI. The colours were shown in the form of coloured silk ribbon mounted in a large volume, and were taken from a range of traditional British sources, such as tartan colours, heraldic colours, and colours of the orders of knighthood. For example, the top colour, blue, is the colour of the Order of the Garter. Many of the colours had appeared in an earlier work published by the British Colour Council in 1934, called the Dictionary of Colour Standards, and I will show you later a revision of this. Now, William Brown was meant to be telling us that in 1937, the French painter Amédée Ozenfant wrote 6 articles on colour for the Architectural Review. Ozenfant thought colour to be an essential element of architecture, rather than something that was considered by the architect as his work was being built. He believed that colour always modifies the form of the building and should receive more careful attention. He also said something about colour ranges, and he believed that an immense service would be done to architects, decorators, house painters, etc., if a chart especially adapted to their particular requirements were established. This chart might contain about 100 hues. As we shall see, not only was the number of colours prescient, but his suggestion that Great Britain take the initiative and that this work might be undertaken by the British Standards Office or the British Colour Council seems also to have been heeded. Although not wedded to the Ostwald system of colour notation, Ozenpon felt that it might be used as a means of specifying colours. In 1938, the British Colour Council and the Royal Horticultural Society issued the first volume of a horticultural colour chart, also called the Wilson colour chart. It consisted of 100 loose plates of printed colour samples, and I show you one here. Each page listed 6 foreign synonyms of the colour name and the equivalents in 4 other colour systems, 3 of which I've already shown you, and 1 of which I've mentioned. So first of all, the Ridgway Colour Standards and Colour Nomenclature in 1912, the Répertoire de Couleurs produced by the French Society of Chrysanthemum Growers in 1905, and the Ostwald system. The need to specify particular colours for camouflage purposes during the Second World War led to the British Standards Institution developing a small range of colours for application to buildings, vehicles and clothing. This was particularly important when one considers, for example, that colour number 15, olive drab, was meant to be similar to US Army olive drab number 9, and was adopted with Lend-Lease and the painting of vehicles in mind. By the 1948 revision, the earlier British Standard range had become a random selection of colours, showing amongst others those used for traffic signs, the London buses, the Post Office, the Ministry of Works, the War Department, the Admiralty, and also the South African Railways Administration. The colours were fine for these sorts of services, but of no help with the specification of colours for interior decoration. In 1949, the Dictionary of Colours for Interior Decoration was published. This work consisted of 3 volumes, 2 of colour samples, and the other a slim list of names and a history of each of the colours. The 378 colours illustrated were shown on 3 surfaces. I show you 2 pages here, with examples of matte, gloss, and also unusually a pile fabric, rather like carpet. 1 reference name and number was given for each of these colours. In the same year, that is 1949, the British Standards Institution produced a small range of 15 colours designed for the decoration of government offices. A couple of years later, the Ministry of Works published a guide which gave specific suggestions as to how these colours could be used. Helpfully, this also included instructions on how to deal with rooms on different sides of the building, with options for warm and cool schemes. This was really a very sophisticated little chart. The expected post-war baby boom and the Butler Education Act of 1944, which had extended secondary education to all, made it clear that a major school building programme would be necessary in England after the war. In the county of Hertfordshire alone, it was realised that 174 new primary schools would have to be built over 15 years. As well as new methods of design and construction, the question of the decoration of these new schools was addressed. 2 young architects, David Ned and Oliver Cox, developed a range of paint colours for this purpose. They were greatly inspired by Ozenpron's pre-war articles in the Architectural Review. These two images show how the design of the classroom had changed after the war, and the emphasis now given to lighting and to colour. In areas where there was constant movement, for example, entrance halls and circulation spaces, there were opportunities to use strong colours, as shown here. You must remember that in the years immediately following the war, England was a fairly drab and colourless place, and colours such as these were considered quite extraordinary by many. Originally published in the Ministry of Education's Building Bulletin No. 9 of 1953, the Archrome Munsell range of colours proved one of the most significant collections of paint colours in the UK. Time sadly will not allow me to expand on the full significance of this range, but everything that follows had its origins in it. The range of 49 colours, including black and white, became commercially available almost immediately, and it was open to any manufacturer to produce these colours. This is an example, for instance, from a company called Craig & Rose, a company based up in Scotland. Building Bulletin No. 9 provided clear instructions on the decoration of classrooms, old and new. And here, for instance, I've shown you, on the left-hand side, the black and white illustration with the colour codes, and I have coloured in, following those codes, the example on the right-hand side. Fairly extraordinary collection of colours, perhaps. 9 years ago, I was asked to investigate the original decorative scheme of London's Royal Festival Hall, modern Britain's first public building of 1951. The London County Council architect, Robert Matthew, masterminded the project, and Leslie Martin led the design, the importance of which will become clear shortly. By 2003, the Royal Festival Hall had been painted white for many years, and in spite of being relatively modern, no one could remember how it had first been decorated 50 years before. An analysis of the paint showed that underneath the white lay a number of strong colours. These had been used in places in a very unusual fashion. This was the palette that I discovered on the ground floor. Now, if you watch closely, I'm going to expand on this. A strong red was found on the side walls, meeting a dull green at the corner. And if you look top right, a dark chocolate brown was employed in areas adjacent to the large windows. These and other devices, as well as adding visual interest, were employed to enhance colour solidity in architecture, something that was considered essential in a building where so much glass was employed. This, incidentally, was one of the points that Osenfant stressed in his 1937 articles. One of my tasks, and this is a page from my report, one of the appendices of my report, one of my tasks was to see if I could find evidence of the influence of Le Corbusier on the colours employed on the Royal Festival Hall. I couldn't directly, but I did identify several colours that could be found in the Archrome Munsell range. However, that didn't make sense, because that range was only published 2 years after the Royal Festival Hall was completed. However, further research showed me that previously, Leslie Martin, the architect, had asked David Mead and Oliver Cox, who I mentioned earlier, to advise him on colours for London schools. And although it was never published, the prototype Archrome Munsell colour range had been offered to Leslie Martin. So in a way, and via Le Corbusier's one-time colleague Amédée Osenfant, and then via David Mead, it can be said that there was an indirect influence of Le Corbusier on the colours of the Royal Festival Hall. These few images show the result of the reintroduction of the 1951 colour scheme. And for example, top left, as you can see, is a rather curious arrangement of a strong red running into a paler, dull green. And then on the right-hand side, you can see this very deep chocolate brown, which was applied in the corners of the building, adjacent to large areas of glass, to windows. And bottom right, you can see how the red was used in between the timber, applied to the columns. You can imagine that when I was taking the paint samples and then looking at them under the microscope, I couldn't understand how one end of the wall was red and the other was green. And so I had to continue taking samples until I actually discovered where one colour began and the other colour ended. The increasing use of the Alchrome range led to the British Standards Institution and the Royal Institute of British Architects to develop a standard range of 100 colours which incorporated the Alchrome Munsell range. This was adopted as BS 2660, 1955, Colours for Building and Decorative Paints. The new British standard was, as described by one of those who worked on it, an architect designed the range. It found immediate favour with a great many architects and designers, and gradually, in an unpremeditated manner, as a colour coordinator for manufactured goods. The potential for rational use of colour was examined in many articles in professional and trade publications at the time, several of which were illustrated with images that evoke the compositions of the Dutch artist Piet Mondrian. Some 15 years after the publication of the 1955 British Standard Range, it was decided that a new standard was required which could be used for coordinating coloured materials in building. This was eventually released in 1972 as BS 4800, Paint Colours for Building Purposes. Now, however, with the almost infinite possibilities in paint colour, the idea of a standard seems to have been forgotten, and we are back where we started, in a most confusing world. Thank you.